Hello, welcome to From Caracas. I'm Laura Prada, and in this opportunity we'll be talking with Sandew Hira, who is Scientific Director of the Institute for Decolonization of Suriname. Welcome.
Thank you, Laura. Great to be here.
Thank you for having the time for us. So I want to know, just to start forward, how is colonization and decolonization seen today in the 21st century?
We think of colonization as political administration by Europe in a colony, by Spain in Venezuela, right? But that is only the political dimension. The colonization has an economic dimension that even if there's no direct administration, the colony is still being exploited. The sugar and coffee is brought to Europe. The labor, the fruits of the labor are being exported to the United States and the rich countries. That is the economic dimension. There's also a knowledge dimension. Colonialism has produced knowledge that says that white Europe is superior to the people in the colonies who are of different colors. Blacks, indigenous people, they are backward. They have no culture. Science has been produced by white Europeans. And that system that colonization has produced is still in our educational system. We learn that Columbus was a hero. We learn that Columbus discovered the world. We don't learn that Columbus was a criminal and that the indigenous people had discovered Columbus. You see? So that is still colonization, although the political administration has gone.
But then that leaves some kind of trace in the minds, in the people
yes.
who have been colonized.
Yes, because if you have been told for centuries that you are black or indigenous and therefore you are backward, you have no knowledge, you have no culture, you have no intelligence, the intelligence is with other people who are white, and science has come from Europe. If that has been told to you for centuries, then you have a mentality of insecurity. If you say something, you wonder, is what I'm saying right or correct? Even if your common sense tells you that this is right or correct. If your common sense tells you that you are a human being like every other human being, that is what common sense tells you. And then some other people come and tell you, but you are inferior human being. Then the colonization of the mind works if you accept that. If you accept your inferiority, if you don't love yourself, you think that you hate yourself. For example, there was a time where black people didn't want to have curly hair because straight hair was seen as the straight hair of white people. Those people have been colonized in their mind because they think they are inferior not having their natural hair, you know. And you have sometimes people who think if you are dark and you are light-skinned, then the light-skinned person is a better human being than the dark-skinned person. And all these things makes you insecure. So that is the colonization of the mind. And what I do in trainings and teaching people of decolonizing the mind is teach them how to love themselves, teach them how the oppressor functions by creating this racist ideology, and analyze how racism works and functions, and help the mind create a mentality of resistance and struggle.
How are we see examples? Which examples we can see today of that colonization of the mind?
Well, it's how do you look at the United States? Many people think that the United States is the country of liberty and freedom. They think that the United States is where you should be. And they think that the United States is the bearer of the the banner of freedom. If you know the history of the United States, is that the United States has been built on theft, on the theft of indigenous land. United States was built on a crime against humanity, which is the crime of slavery. United States had apartheid in law until the 1960s. There was no equal rights for blacks and whites for blacks in the until 1965, where they had voting rights. There was no universal suffrage in the United States until 1965. So United States is presenting himself as the country of freedom, but all over the world it has organized coups by the CIA in Guatemala, in Iran, in Chile. So the United States has fomented radical fundamentalism of Islam in Afghanistan, has financed oppression of Palestinians in Israel. How can, if you have all these facts, how can you say that the United States is a country of freedom? You can only say that if your mind has been colonized.
Well, talking about United States and colonization, we see today the example of Puerto Rico here in the Caribbean, that still today it's a colony in its full sense. It's applied on that country. And also we have the rest of the Caribbean islands that we see some of them that are not colonies in the full sense, but they remain attached to that colonial power.
Yeah. Well, you have in the Caribbean the idea that they still call Britain the motherland, France and England the motherland. And that is a strange kind of mother that enslaved its own children, you know, that oppressed their own children, that treated the children as inferior human beings. So if you call France your motherland, and you think French culture is such a high, superior culture, then that means that you don't value your own culture. You don't value your own language or your own traditions, and you think that you're backward. That is a colonization of the mind. But then there are people like Frantz Fanon, Aimé Césaire, black philosophers that Frantz Fanon wrote a book, Black Skin, White Mask, where he argues that black people have been colonized in the mind so much that they want to look like white, they talk like white, they walk like white, they dress like whites, you know, they feast like whites, because they are ashamed of their own African heritage. And one of the elements of reparation, mental reparation, is that African people and people of color who have been colonized look again at their own ancient civilizations and can see that the image of backwardness that is conveyed about the Indian, the Chinese, the African, the Maya Aztec civilization of being not modern, that is a false image. People had ideas of humanness, of human being, that everybody is a human being and needs to be treated as a human being. That is part of a lot of indigenous philosophies from China, Asia, Africa, Middle East, Islam, Hinduism, Pachamama here in Latin America. These are all ideas. But in the West, philosophers like Kant, Hegel, Hume developed the ideas that colonized and black people were inferior people, were not human beings. So the idea of superior and inferior human beings was vested in the European Enlightenment. So if you want to create a decolonized mind, then you have to attack the European Enlightenment philosophers that created these ideas of superiority. So we need new textbooks that teaches you what the philosophers in China, India, Africa, Latin America has said about envisioning a society of justice and peace.
Now, to round up that idea a little bit more, how is then colonization seen from the colonial, the ones that colonized, and how is seen from the colonizers' point of view?
Okay, now
because sorry, because you yourself, you've been you have given talks in the heart of the countries that were those colonial powers.
Yes.
So based on that experience, how is that the colonization seen from both sides?
Well, I've lectured in the United States, in different countries in Europe, in the Caribbean, in Malaysia, in South Africa, and my experience there is that there is a decolonial movement of resistance, because that is my audience of where I lecture. And this decolonial movement of resistance within the heart of the beast in Europe and the United States is a vibrant community. So in the regular media, not like Telesu that gives me a podium, but the regular media won't engage in plurality of voices. So you won't have on CNN different views on Venezuela, for example. If you would be a objective medium, then you will have Guaido and you have the vision of Maduro, because you hear both sides. That is not the case. There's no free press in the West. Free press means that all voices get an opportunity to be heard. That's not the case, and that's why we need our own press. We need our own cultural channels. So what I see is the colonizer has instituted a network of institutions for information, communication, and education, the media, the schools, the museums, etc., where they put out the narrative of the colonizer, which is we are the bearer of freedom and liberty. And therefore, they don't give the information about the oppression in Palestine, in Yemen, in Venezuela now, the boycott that is going on in Venezuela, the lawlessness of international law. You don't get that through the natural media. So what I do in my, in my trainings is helping build that movement of people with a decolonized mind that are proud enough to take up the struggle and are not afraid to say the things that they don't want to hear.
I suppose that one of those things that they don't want to hear, those colonial powers, is about reparations.
Yeah.
We know that organizations, regional organizations like CARICOM in this case, that is in the Caribbean, they have created a commission to talk about reparations for the damages caused by colonization. And how is that seen today? Are those colonial powers in the position or willing to accept that request, that lawfully request?
Okay, let me give you the example of Holland. Country I know very well because they colonized Suriname. And they colonized also Indonesia. So when they colonized Indonesia in 1945, the Dutch were occupied by the Germans and lost Indonesia to the Japanese. And after 1945, the Japanese were beaten and the Indian nationalists declared their liberty. And the Dutch sent 150,000 troops there, 60,000 military, sorry, and killed 150,000 people there. And with the support of the United States, they negotiated a deal. And in that deal, Indonesia had to pay reparations to Holland for property that Holland has lost in Indonesia. That is a form of reparation that rewards the criminal, right? So we know there are two forms of reparation. One form where the reparation is paid to the person who committed a crime, and the person thinks that what he has lost should be compensated in the crime. And we are talking about reparations for the victims of a crime, for enslavement, for colonization.
Exactly.
And the perpetrator of that crime doesn't want to hear about reparations, doesn't want us to put the topic on the agenda.
Why?
Because reparations has a material component you have to pay. If you have stolen gold from me, you have to pay back my gold that you have stolen. If you have stolen labor from me, slave labor, you have to compensate the labor that you have paid for me. In fact, if you have occupied my land, you should have paid rent to put your companies on my land. You see, if you have caused human suffering, it would be normal to pay for compensation of human suffering. So there are a lot of reasons to pay reparations if you think in terms of justice. Then you have the value of justice, and the value of justice tells you reparations is needed if you have committed historical injustice. So if you have a civilized nation, then you admit that you have committed historical crimes, and then you are willing to pay reparations. An example of such a nation is Germany. Germany committed the crime of Holocaust. And when the Jews asked for reparations, the Germans were, after they were beaten, mind you, they left the legacy of Nazism. They accepted that Germany had committed a historical crime through Nazism, and then offered reparations to the Jews. And the Jews asked for 800 million. They got 70 billion. A lot more than they asked for. And this is because if you have a level of civilization that acknowledges that you have committed historical injustice, then the sky is the limit. Then we can talk about how to pay reparations. And so if the countries who are now confronted with the demands of the CARICOM countries don't want to engage into the discussions, that only means that their level of civilization is now very low, and that we have to work in these communities to raise the civilized level.
That's in the case of the Caribbean, but in the case, for example, of Africa, we have the Democratic Republic of Congo, we have Congo-Brazzaville. We know the diamond situation in Congo. We know what happened in Namibia, in South Africa. We know how that the continent itself has suffered from colonization, has suffered from slavery. And those powers give their back totally to them. How? Well, why is that?
Well, I was telling you that the Germans were civilized regarding
the Holocaust.
But they were uncivilized regarding Namibia. In Namibia, they committed genocide against the Herero people in Namibia, which was a tribe. And when they committed the genocide there, they used the techniques that later was going to be used during the Holocaust. For example, the medical experiments, the concentration camps, in fact, even the order, the so-called Vernichtigingsorder, the order to destroy a population that was used during the Holocaust was articulated and formulated in Namibia. But until this today, then the Germans won't pay reparations to the Namibians. Why? Because the Germans are civilized regarding the Holocaust, but are uncivilized and racist regarding Africa. And that is the general attitude of Europe towards Africa. Take the Congo. The Belgians have killed 10 million people in the Congo. They cut off the hands of the women and the children to force the men to collect rubber from the rubber trees. And they have to come with a certain quantity of rubber. And if they didn't have the quantity, they cut the hands of the wife. And there are pictures with 10,000 of hands that have been cut in the Congo. Every civilized nation would acknowledge, would apologize, and would pay reparations.
Exactly.
And that has not been done. And what we are appealing to in Europe is appealing to the consciousness and the morality of white people in Europe to acknowledge the crime that has been committed, to apologize for it, and to do the right thing, which is compensation and reparation.
Is that part of also decolonizing the mind?
Yes, because decolonization of the mind is not only decolonizing the mind of the colonized people, it's also decolonizing the mind of the colonizer, who thinks it is quite normal to commit historical injustice and do nothing about it. So we want to civilize the uncivilized whites. The whites who are uncivilized by not acknowledging that there is something like human being that needs to be respected in the humanness and the humanity. We want to let them know that another world is possible in which they acknowledge other people as human beings and act in a way that respects other human beings. And one form of respect is reparations, that you acknowledge what you have done. If you have cut hundreds of thousands hands in the Congo, it's just a normal thing. If you are not personally involved in it, but as a state, as a society, you have profited from the rubber, then the Belgians should do that, as the French should do for Vietnam and for the other colonies in Africa, and the British and the Dutch should do also.
Now I want you to briefly talk to me about your experience here in Venezuela, because you've been giving some lectures. I want you to speak to me a little bit about this so our audience can understand better why we are talking to you today here from Caracas.
All right. I was in Caracas a few months ago at the People's Assembly. And I was invited here to give a week full of lectures on reparations and decolonizing the mind to people in Venezuela who are now taking up the issues of how mental slavery works in Venezuela. There is a revolution going on here. There's a Chavista revolution going on for 20 years now. And that revolution is not an easy thing, not only because of the boycott and the struggle and the coup d'etat which has taken place by Guaido, but also because of how difficult it is for people to uplift, and Chavez did a wonderful job in uplifting people and raising their consciousness. So I'm very humble to be able to experience this revolutionary spirit in Venezuela, because they tackle questions which are difficult. Reparation is a difficult question, yet it is part of the public debate here. It's not part of the public debate in Holland, where it should take place, or in France, or in Ecuador, or in Colombia, you know. But although race is a very touchy question, a very difficult question, the fact that Venezuela has put it on the agenda testifies to the strengths of the revolution.
Thank you, Sandy, for sharing with us this time.
Thank you, Laura, for inviting me.
We've been talking to Sandew Hira, who is the Scientific Director of the Institute of Decolonization of Suriname, today here from Caracas. Thank you for sharing with us these minutes. Until the next time, thank you again.